Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great weekend or you had a great weekend. My name is Sukaja and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a book that I read recently and absolutely came about to appreciate. This book is Birds and Other Stories by Daphne Du Maurier. If you're not aware, I am a part of a book club which I started a couple of months ago, and this is a virtual online book club which happens every month, and we read one book by Daphne Du Maurier every month. And this is mainly for people who are fans of her work, Rebecca. If you'd like to join the book club, then feel free to DM me on Instagram. I'll link that in the description box down below. Without further ado, let's deep dive into this book. If you're someone who loves short stories or is looking to get into the world of short stories, then perhaps you should watch this video. I liked about 4 of the 6 stories in here. Many of the stories have a lot of themes that are recurring. Let's start with the first story. Birds is the main story of this collection, and it is about a little seaside town where this man and his wife and kids live, and it's somewhere in Cornwall. And one day the birds start to go a little berserk. There's some kind of unusual activity that happens among the birds, and suddenly the chickens are ill, suddenly things happen which don't have reasons and we can't explain them in any way. And it also has an environmental twist to it, in the sense usually we believe that man is overpowering animal and man comes first in the hierarchy, but in this case animals are sort of dominating man, and that's what we see in this first story. We see this seaside town becoming like it goes into chaos because birds start attacking people in the town, and that's what the story is about. So it was brilliantly written. It's even made into a movie by Alfred Hitchcock. If you're interested, I'll link that in the description if you'd like to rent and watch it on YouTube. I thought it was a very unique idea to think about. Of all the things she could have demonized, she demonized birds, and it was carried out really well. Like, it felt like it would be something that's pretty plausible in the future, perhaps if birds lost their minds or if we encroached upon their environment, perhaps birds would go berserk. That said, let's move on to the second story. The second story in this collection is Monte Verita. So this is about a mountain named Monte Verita which exists somewhere in Europe along the mountain ranges in the French Alps. And this mountain is home to a monastery which calls on young women who are sort of put into a trance. They have a calling, they get a vision, and they are expected to go to that monastery. And it's only for people who have a calling. It's not for everybody, and it's not for men, certainly. Many women start disappearing from the village nearby. It's a very peculiar thing, and it's very eerie and bizarre. Those are many of the qualities that are there in the stories in this collection. They are pretty bizarre. So there's no explanation as to why this is happening, and apparently there's some kind of spiritual force that is doing this to the women in the village. I didn't particularly enjoy that story because it was more like a novella. It was 100 pages long. But there are a lot of viewers here who have put a psychoanalytical spin on this story, and they think that it's got a lot of depth, a lot of layers, and they would have liked for it to be a full-fledged novel itself. I just felt the first 2 pages of the story kind of caught me off guard, because I was really expecting a lot of, gothic stories in this collection, along the lines of Edgar Allan Poe, but then once I finished Birds, I was really on a high, and I was expecting that the next story would be equally, of the same momentum and caliber. But then this story kind of caught me off guard and shook me back to reality, and I was like, okay, so this is about mountaineering and a bunch of people interested in an expedition and how they end up discovering this monastery that, calls on people, women in particular, and so this man loses his wife that way. I won't say anything else, but does he get her back? Does he not? Is he able to continue being her husband? Will he ever get to go to the monastery and rescue her? That is left to your imagination, so you have to read the story for that. The third story in this collection was about an apple tree, and this also I felt was very eerie, but I think it is known to have some literary merit. I felt like it drew from a lot of folk tales. This is a story about a man and a woman, and the story does deal with marriage and their marriage in particular, and I felt like the first few pages of the story describes their relationship and the kind of lives that they have led until this point where the woman is too old, and then one day she succumbs to an illness and dies. And throughout her life, the woman was typical wife. Throughout her life, she was the kind of person who would always look out for her husband. She was always there for him. She'd always think of ways to make his life easier. But then suddenly she is no more, and the husband doesn't even get affected by the fact that his wife is no more, and he has no feeling whatsoever. And while she existed, he seemed to have had an affair as well. So this is brought out towards the latter half of the story, and the woman's soul kind of inhabits a tree in the man's orchard, in the man's garden. So it's an apple tree. And this story kind of explores the psychological dimensions of grief, and it really looks into grief closely, and guilt, a mixture of grief and guilt, and how he acts on that. And he believes that the tree does indeed take revenge on his wife's behalf in so many different ways. So there's a haunting that happens, and it's the tree that kind of haunts the man's existence after his wife's death. It's an interesting story. And then after that, we have The Little Photographer, which was by far one of my favorite stories in the collection after Birds. And this I found particularly interesting. It's about a woman, a marquise, who decides to go to a seaside town for a vacation with her children and a nanny. And in the seaside town, she meets this man who is kind of a cripple, in the sense it's portrayed in a bad light, of course. Like, I must say, a disclaimer for people who are sensitive about disability and things like that in books. There's a lot of focus on him being disabled for some reason, which I felt was unnecessary. But anyway, she meets this photographer who decides to take her pictures and things like that, and a relationship develops between the two of them. Once she goes by, it'll not exist anymore. So that was an interesting story that has some, scary things that happen, the consequences of such actions. And she's portrayed as a pretty narcissistic woman who only thinks about herself. But then again, if you read this story in a different time, and if you applied it in our present day, we would take the side of the marquise, according to me. And the descriptions in this story of the seaside town are absolutely breathtakingly beautiful, and I highly recommend reading it for that. The Little Photographer is kind of portrayed as this effeminate guy. Then there's a toxic relationship that kind of develops between the two of them. You should read the story in order to understand it better. But the next story in this collection is called Kiss Me Again, Stranger, and I like this one too. But again, it was really gripping. It was a real page turner, this particular story, and it was about man and a woman. This collection of stories really explores human relationships between a husband and wife, an old man and his family, a young girl and a man who just met. So there's a lot of these kinds of relationships in here. This girl is working at a movie theater, and she's selling tickets. But one day she meets this man who suddenly falls for her on the spot, and he decides to follow her home. Now, if you read this story in today's context, this would be perceived as stalking and quite questionable. But in this story, it seems to work for some reason, and you end up empathizing with the character, even though he is morally not on the right path. So he follows this girl, goes with her wherever she's going, and they end up going to a cemetery. And I won't say anything else about what happens. I'm just going to leave it there. This is a pretty sinister story. It's written during the time right after the Second World War, so it's set in that period. Pretty interesting. I'm not going to say anything more. The last story in the collection is called The Old Man, and this was my least favorite story because I felt there wasn't enough given to the reader, and it is very fragmented. So overall, this collection is quite a roller coaster ride. It takes you up and down, and you don't know not what to expect. If you're someone who's looking for a sweet escape into a world that is unpredictable and one without certainty, read The Birds for sure, and then read the other stories if you're interested in looking at human relationships. I think relationships between men and women, and there's all the dynamics of class coming into the picture as we see in The Little Photographer, and there's commentary on a lot of things. Definitely worth reading for the book club. There's a lot to discuss. We ended up discussing for 1.5 hours, even though it was just me and Meera from YouTube. I'm just gonna give her a shout out. So thank you for being there, Meera, for the discussion, and I hope more people will join the book club because we're now reading Jamaica Inn, again by Daphne Du Maurier, and we're ending the year with a bang by reading My Cousin Rachel, which is by far one of her most interesting works. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you will give this collection of stories a chance. Even if some of the stories in here piqued your interest, let me know in the comments. If you've read any of her other short stories, do let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so that you'll be notified every time I post a video on here. I'll be back soon with more bookish content. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sane, and I will see you soon. Bye!